Of course, you know the auto industry so well. You took it apart and put it back together for President Obama, in fairness. You know EVs. Where are we? Is it as bad as it looks right now? Because at first it was really the cat's meow, and now the bloom is off the rose.
Look, it's so like so many things. You start something new, people get excited about it. You do get often into a little bit of irrational exuberance, to borrow Alan Greenspan's famous phrase, and the world kind of resets. And so that's what's happening. You had a lot of early adopters, you had a lot of enthusiasm, and I think as this has settled down, people have taken a step back and taken a look around. As you know, there's been a much greater emphasis on hybrids, which are doing really well. So people haven't given up the idea of an energy transition. They're just a little worried about EVs, particularly about the range anxiety.
Representative Haley Stevens of Michigan served with Steve Rattner on President Obama's auto task force, and her district outside Detroit has a lot at stake in the move to EVs. She acknowledges that there's some hesitation after an initial spurt, but says it should come as no surprise.
We were never expecting a linear trajectory of growth. We've certainly seen big numbers coming out, 18%, 1 million EVs sold. Very pleased to see where we are this year, technically over the last year and the year before that. But we realize it's going to be a little bit more of a curve than just that straight linear line.
It's not so much that consumers don't want EVs as it is that they want them at affordable prices, according to J.D. Power Consumer Research.
There are 3 key factors that consumers look for to transition to an EV. The first is there an EV substitute that meets their needs? The second is, can they afford it? And then the third is, will the infrastructure work for them? So when we break down those first 2 and we look at where manufacturers really have the most impact, today we compare availability of EVs to ICE, and only 43% of the market is covered with a viable substitute. And that's relative to consumer preferences relative to the segments, the brands, and the price that they want to pay. You know, premium segments have more market coverage at 73%. But now as we're poised to move into that early majority phase, there's just not enough coverage for mass market segments.
If part of the problem with EVs are the prices, why did the big automakers start with the high end of the markets? Steve Rattner says it was understandable given the history of the industry and some of the mistakes made in the past.
Look, I think part of what went on in Detroit specifically is the industry had been criticized for decades as being behind, that it missed SUVs, it missed compacts, it missed this, it missed that. And so they really wanted to be ahead of the curve. And GM, going back to its investment in Cruise and so forth, was determined to be ahead of the curve. I think they also made a determination, which I'm not sure was wrong, that the early buyers were probably going to be high-end people because they had the income, they didn't matter as much, that the cost of the car was greater, they had more commitment perhaps to the energy transition aspect of it. And making an inexpensive EV is tough. It's really tough. Making anything small and inexpensive in Detroit is tough, but EVs especially tough. So I don't think it may not have been absolutely perfectly planned, but you don't get everything 100% right.
There is, of course, a middle course for those in the market for a new car that is environmentally friendly, or at least friendlier. Going halfway with a plug-in hybrid, which may provide a gateway to the full EV down the road.
Last year, EV year-over-year growth was 50%. Plug-in hybrid year-over-year growth was 36%. But EVs outsold plug-in hybrids 4-to-1. And the reason is because there are a lot more EVs available than plug-in hybrids. You know, there's a consumer element to this question, and then also the manufacturers. Manufacturers have to balance their portfolio and meet the emission requirements. But from a consumer standpoint, we do collect data from both EV owners and plug-in hybrid owners. And our ownership data tells us that overall consumers are very satisfied with EVs, more so than PHEVs, in almost every category that we measure, and especially in that category of the total cost of ownership. It's much higher satisfaction for EVs. But that said, PHEVs are a great introduction to EVs. And our data shows that 70% of plug-in hybrid owners are very likely to consider stepping up into an EV.
There are people who want to go right into EVs, and as I said, a lot of the early adopters have. And there are others who are committed and believe in climate change, or they just simply want to save money on fuel, doesn't matter, and they're going to take the hybrid step. Hybrids have been around a long time, and they went through their own sort of cycle. They caught on for a little while, and then you kind of forgot about them. And now every car maker is going to have a hybrid version, I think, of most of their cars. And I think it's great for people to have a set of choices.
And then there's the question of charging your new EV. When and where and how? And will that high-speed charging station be there when you need it most?
The number one barrier to adoption is available infrastructure and the reliability of infrastructure. There needs to be more infrastructure, and it needs to be more reliable. Now, we have noted some improvements during the past year with the implementation of all of the NEVI funds and really getting that fast charger on some of the interstates. We've noticed a 5% improvement.
One of the issues that's been raised is the charging stations, the infrastructure for charging stations. I mean, I've followed what happened with Hertz as they really went into EVs in a big way. And then I read the article actually on Bloomberg that said one of the problems I'd never thought about, when you go pick up your electric vehicle at a strange town, you wonder, how am I going to get charged at my local motel? Where are we on the infrastructure, and how much of a challenge is that?
First of all, I thought the Hertz thing was fascinating, and the idea that never occurred to anybody that if you fly into Omaha, you're going to want to know where to get your car charged and not know. Look, we're way behind. I think there was something like $7 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure bill for charging stations, and at least an article I saw in the Washington Post that literally 7 have been built, 7. And so we have a long way to go on the charging thing, because the Americans, we have much longer commutes than they do in Europe. And range anxiety, rightly or wrongly, is very real in this country, and so we've got to fix the charging infrastructure.
Has the U.S. government, done enough? You mentioned some of what's been done, and I think most people think that the Biden administration has done more than has been done before. Is it enough?
Biden administration has absolutely done more than has been done before. There's no question between infrastructure, between certainly the IRA, which is off the charts success, if you define success as people taking advantage of the tax incentives and things that are in there. I think we've done more than enough. No, look, the one thing that we should have done in this country, still can do, although highly unlikely, is a huge tax on gas. I'm a market guy, and you want the market to operate as best you can, as opposed to government regulation or mandates. And if we had a 50-cent tax on gasoline, rebated to low-end consumers so they were kept completely whole, you'd see a hell of a lot faster energy transition. Of course, that's what they've done in Europe, and that's part of why Europe is well ahead of us.
So what about that European model, or China for that matter? We're subsidizing EVs and EV charging stations, but how much does the regulatory structure in one country affect the EV demand and adoption in another?
I think it's incredibly important to look at the global regulations and look at those trends for consumers as well as industry. It's a bit early to really connect all the dots and understand that if regulations and consumer interest in one market will apply to our market. But when we do look at data within our country, which is so vast and large, I mean, we stratify consumer sentiment down to the zip code level. And within the U.S., as you know, several states have adopted that zero emission policy. And our data shows that in many of these states that have adopted those zero emission requirements, we are seeing more adoption.
As we go into these policy issues, obviously we end up with politics. You mentioned about the Trump administration putting tariffs on. And even now, as I look at the Biden administration really pushing EVs, I don't know how that's playing in my home state of Michigan or Ohio, places like that, because it's generally thought, whether rightly or wrongly, that that is not good for auto workers.
Well, so it's also interesting, I saw this the other day, is that if you look at polling data, Republicans basically say, I'm never going to buy an EV, and Democrats say, I can't wait to buy an EV. So even things like this that should be a more apolitical choice as to what car you buy have become politicized. The problem with EVs with Michigan or Ohio, as you well know, is that they require less labor to put together. And so you get into this tension between the energy transition, which I'm sure the auto workers in principle believe in, and the fact that it could have an impact on jobs. But look, at the end, we have to go through this energy transition for the sake of the planet. We have no choice. And therefore, if it has some impact on auto jobs, we just have to help these people find other things to do.
Representative Stevens sees the need to make sure the auto workers in her home state of Michigan aren't left behind in the move to EVs, but she also sees new job opportunities as well.
My building trades are very enthusiastic to see new plants being built, being rehabbed. Every time I talk to our building trades union, they are busy. They are at max employment. They're working many long hours. And so that's an exciting piece on the infrastructure side and the manufacturing side. We got, with the Inflation Reduction Act, also investment dollars to rehabbing manufacturing shops themselves for this energy transition. But we can't be naive to how we need to responsibly deal workers in. But we cannot have an electric vehicle revolution without the auto workers.
But in the end, the EV story may come back to government incentives. How big and for how long? And as much as the Biden administration has done already, it still may not be enough.
Certainly, we're thrilled that we got the tax credit piece done. And I think if it was solely up to Democratic lawmakers from Michigan, we would have done more. And we hear that from those who are in the intersection between distribution and the dealership world, that more tax credits might be desirable here.
How much of it is up to the government as we try to get to EVs, and how much it really is up to the consumer and the auto companies providing products that really are affordable that people will buy?
As I said, I'm not a big government mandate guy. I much prefer the market to work. I think, as economists would say, there are externalities involved with burning gasoline. You're damaging the environment, and you're not paying your share of the cost of cleaning it up or the cost of preventing it in the first place. And so it is appropriate, I think, for the government to use market-oriented mechanisms like taxes or incentives, and we prefer incentive. Everybody likes incentives better than taxes, but I think taxes are also important in order to essentially equilibrate the price and make it fair to all concerned.